Welcome back, everybody. We're about to start our second panel on air pollution. The panel will be chaired by Dr. Navroz K. Dubash, Professor, Center for Policy Research. The panelists for this panel include, the panel is on Research for Policy Action on Air Pollution in collaboration with CECFEE, Center for Research on Economics of Climate, Food, Energy and Environment. And to chair the panel, we have Navroz K. Dubash, Professor, Center for Policy Research. The panelists include Shibani Ghosh, Fellow, Center for Policy Research, E. Somanathan, Professor, Indian Statistical Institute and Program Director for Center for Research on Economics of Climate, Food, Energy and Environment. Ritesh Kumar Singh, Joint Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change, Government of India. He'll be joining us shortly. Nitin Sethi, Senior Associate Editor, Business Standard, and Vinuta Gopal, Co-founder and Director, Asar Social Impact Advisors. Information on all panelists is given in your brochure. And over to you, Navroz.
Thank you very much, Rajika. Welcome to all of you to the CPR Dialogues. I think many of you were here in the first session of this morning, and this is an effort by CPR. This is the first annual CPR Dialogues, and it's really an effort to think about the bigger, longer-term strategic issues that are facing India, and to do so drawing on the research both of CPR colleagues as well as distinguished people who we've asked into these conversations to join us, both from India as well as from around the world. So very, very glad that you're here, and we hope that this is a successful first of what will be a series of annual conversations. This session is focused on air pollution. As chair, I'm supposed to sort of motivate the conversation, but I really think there's not much motivation to be done. Most of us are aware of the seriousness of the air pollution problem. Most of us are aware of the challenges of it. Most of us spend a lot of time looking at our apps in the morning, unfortunately. I just looked at ours. The air quality at Lodi Road is 305, well above safe levels. This is a story we've heard, unfortunately, for much of the winter. When we put this panel together, we have tried to do two things. The first is, if we're going to deal with air pollution, we need to have a narrative, a way of talking about it, a set of agreements around what we think about the problem, its seriousness, and how we might approach it. So the first presenter today, my colleague Shibani Ghosh, is going to talk us through one narrative, one set of points that might form the basis of a conversation based on work that we've been doing at CPR, and we invite you into commenting on that. Following that, we'll have Professor Somanathan, who is from the Indian Statistical Institute and is the coordinator of our co-host for this panel. This is the Center for Research on Climate, Food, Energy and Environment, and we're very glad to co-host this with this organization. Professor Somanathan is going to actually take a slightly different tack, because if we're going to solve this problem, we also need to really understand, both scientifically in terms of what is actually going on, details about the contours of this air pollution problem. So Som is going to share with us some research that has been going on at ISI and with some other colleagues that tries to unpack the details of the air pollution problem. Once they have spoken briefly, maybe 15 to 20 minutes each, we then have a very, very strong panel with us. I'm just going to start at the end there. We have Vinuta Gopal from Asar, who's previously was with Greenpeace, is well known to many of us. Nitin Sethi, who along with Air Pollution Monitors is often our morning companion through his columns, now with the Business Standard, previously with the Hindu and other papers. And Mr. Ritesh Kumar Singh, who is on his way over to us. Unfortunately, another predictable occurrence in Delhi winters with government officials is being detained in parliamentary sessions. So he's dealing with Parliament, which, as we all agree, is an important function as well, but he'll be joining us soon. So after the initial presentations, we will then have a conversation, invite our panelists to comment on the presentations, but then also have a broader conversation and make sure we get as many voices from the audience as possible. So with this, let me turn it over to Shibani, maybe about 15 minutes, Shibani.
Good morning. Am I audible? Yes. It's good. Yeah? Good morning, and thank you so much, Navroz, for the introduction to the panel. So today I'm going to present some of CPR's work along with work that we've done with some of our collaborators and kind of build on work that exists, has been done by other institutions and individuals as well. The key kind of work where we want to take this is that what should be our public messaging in this time of a national crisis, as we'd like to call, of the air quality in India and particularly in the National Capital Region. And when we talk about messaging, we're really not just focusing on communication, which often is what messaging is, but also what are the messages that we want to communicate, and how do we kind of bring down or crystallize all this information, all this kind of public pressure, rage, interest, awareness that we have and fortunately is growing, and how do we kind of bring that together to kind of build more targeted and focused political pressure as well as kind of moving towards a very deliberate and conscious agenda. So we've kind of thought of certain messages going forward, and we were hoping to present them in today's event and see if we could get some feedback from the panelists as well as those in the audience, as if we have identified the messages correctly and could perhaps be modified in something which is more useful. So kind of moving forward from here, why do we need, why is there a need for clear public messaging? Clearly, as we all know that, as Navroz mentioned earlier, there are several apps, there are more and more kind of evidence and reports coming out almost on a daily basis, which are making the point very clear that there is a massive problem at hand. But there is a need to kind of understand what do we want going forward. I mean, one of the first reasons why we think that there's a need for public messaging is that there's almost this tendency to normalize severe levels of air quality in the public consciousness, because we're almost at this level where we think, acha, Diwali is coming, or it's October, there is going to be crop burning, but we're okay after that. But that obviously is not the correct understanding, as I'll show in a bit. So we need to avoid that sense of acceptance or inevitability of poor air quality. Secondly, we need public pressure to ensure that there's some form of political action to trigger it, but also to sustain it moving forward. So I mean, if there is going to be some form of political action, whether it's in form of coming up with an action plan, or it's in form of throwing money at a problem, that might be triggering it, but to actually sustain it, to ensure that plan or that measure actually has some impact, we do need to ensure that the public keeps pushing for it. Also, that episodic and reactionary measures are not something that are sustainable. And we've seen that, for instance, in the crop burning issue that, the government proudly announced that it is going to be spending a huge amount of money in subsidizing something like the happy seeders, or that the Badarpur thermal power plant is going to be closed, which it was. But the point is that these are just, reactionary measures or just single measures that are not going to sustain, or provide us a sustainable solution to what's clearly a long-term problem. Next, that we need both the private and the public actors to be involved continuously and in an extremely effective and constructive manner. We cannot just expect the government actors to, this is not just an enforcement problem. So we can't just look at the public actors for solutions, but we also have to somehow reach out to private actors, whether it's the industrialists, whether it's private citizens, whether it's RWAs. Everyone has to be involved in, if we have to reach, achieve some form of a long-term solution to the problem of air quality. And finally, I think there is sufficient evidence, not just in terms of health costs, but also economic costs of poor air quality across the nation. So I mean, the kind of evidence that we are getting is quite cogent, both internationally and nationally, and therefore we need to kind of use that evidence to ensure that it influences our messaging, influences our actions going forward, and ensures that what we're doing is sustainable. So what should our messaging on air pollution look like? Firstly, I think, some of this is very basic information to most of you in the room, but just thought I'll go over it very quickly, that obviously we're looking at a very complex cocktail of pollutants. And it's not very easy to communicate or kind of explain what are these pollutants and how do they affect us, and what are the sources, how can we, reduce them. So in that sense, the particulate matter 2.5 is something that's often used as a pretty good surrogate or a proxy pollutant to explain the problem. So I think the messaging going forward needs to kind of explain why we are going with PM 2.5 and why that's a pretty good proxy to rely on when we're talking about numbers of air quality. Secondly, that air pollution is obviously an annual problem. It's not a winter problem as it's often misunderstood to be. And it's actually multiple times safe levels of particulate matter are experienced throughout the year. So I just moving forward to my next slide, where you can see, and these are colleagues at CPR who put together this slide, which clearly shows, I mean, if you look at the chart, and these are three cities that we've looked at, Delhi, Patna, and Kanpur. All three cities are situated in the Indo-Gangetic Plains, and which is considered to be one single airshed. Now, if you look at the PM 2.5 levels in 2018, Delhi had 56% of the days in either poor or worse quality in terms of air quality. Patna was at 49% and Kanpur at 32%. So it's not something that we suffer only during winters. And if you look at in terms of good days, Delhi had 6 good days in the whole year in 2018. Patna had 1 good day, and Kanpur had 37 good days. So we're really faced with a massive problem here. It's not restricted to November, December. Also, if I just go back, the problem is not restricted to Delhi and National Capital Region, even though it seems that the regulatory architecture is kind of very much focused on the Delhi National Capital Region, but the whole airshed of the Indo-Gangetic Plain is affected, as well as other parts of the country. I mean, it's not just the Indo-Gangetic Plains, but there are other cities which are outside the plains as well, which are definitely experiencing much worse air quality than before. And finally, this is not an urban problem. Rural areas throughout the airshed as well as outside are experiencing very poor quality. One of the reasons could be because there's an increased use of solid fuels in the kitchens in rural areas, which not only contribute to indoor air pollution, which we well know, but also are a significant contributor to ambient air quality. So this is very basic information which I think should be part of any public messaging going out, that we should not think that this is a Delhi or an urban-centric problem and needs solutions which are very city-centric, because that's not going to help the problem. This is just to show the number of days and percentage of days that I just mentioned earlier. This graph actually, we wanted to present this to show that it's not clearly a Delhi-centric problem, but if you look at the states, our Indian norms, the NAAQS, the acceptable annual average is 40 micrograms per meter cube, and Delhi's annual average is actually at 130. Uttar Pradesh and Haryana are over 100. So there's no what we really need to look at is annual averages, which clearly are way beyond even the Indian standards. And perhaps most of us know that the Indian standards are actually multiple times the acceptable WHO standards, which are at 10. So we are much worse off most of the year than what is acceptable by our lenient domestic standards, but certainly way off the acceptable international safe standards. Moving on, what else our public messaging should include, of course, is the health implications. I mean, it's not just the severity of the health impacts, which many of us are aware of. There was a recent WHO report which said about 1 lakh children died in India because of exposure to air pollution. The recent study that came out, which was reported in Lancet just last month, which said that 12.5% deaths in India in 2017, that's 1 out of 8 persons died in India due to exposure to poor air quality. So, I mean, in terms of numbers, there's no doubt that this is an extremely severe problem, and it affects across socio-economic demography. So we are not just talking about a particularly vulnerable group. Of course, they are affected, but it would affect people across vulnerabilities. In terms of morbidity, mortality, reduction quality of life, everything is worsening, and there is cogent data, not only internationally, but nationally, to support that view. Also, if you just look at a cause for disease, air pollution is only second to child and maternal malnutrition, and in fact ranks higher than unsafe water and unsanitary conditions, things that we actually associate with developing countries in terms of burden of disease. Air pollution is now second on the charts, higher than unhygienic conditions and unsanitary conditions. Not only the problem is severe in terms of health impacts, but it's also that we're just looking at the tip of the iceberg. So when we talk about health impacts of air pollution, the first thing that comes to our mind is generally respiratory or cardiovascular diseases or pulmonary disease is what we're generally talking about. But there's more and more information coming that, it leads to, there's an impact on cognitive abilities, birth weight, child growth, obesity, and could also be a cause of cancer. So, I mean, these are things that we're just starting to get studies on, but it's only going to grow, and it is scary, the kind of information that's out there and likely to come out more and more. Moving on to what are the sources of air pollution in the National Capital Region, my colleagues at CPR with collaborators outside have looked at the 4 main studies, and many of us have heard of these studies, and kind of tried to map them out to see what are the main sources of air pollution and this is only the National Capital Region because that's where we had the maximum data for, where do they map out? And it seems like there are 4 major sources, and all of them are, it's kind of a 25% into 4 problem. So if you look at industry, transport, biomass and waste burning, which includes crop burning, and dust, we're looking at each of them being in the range of, say, 15 to 30%. And each of these studies kind of come out in that range. I'm sorry, it's not entirely readable on the left, but the point we are making here is that we really cannot concentrate on just one source of pollution. And even if we did concentrate and manage to effectively solve that problem, we have 3 very other significant problems that we have to look at. And therefore, finger pointing of any form is not going to help. So the industry, the industry turning around and saying it's not our fault, it's the private vehicles, or the buses turning around saying it's actually the farmers, it's not going to help because each of these actually are very discrete problems. They need to be prioritized based on the time of the year. They need to be prioritized based on the specific regulatory, technical, political, institutional characteristics of that sector. So it's important to actually really understand that we need to make progress in all of these 4 sectors, and not just one is going to be of much help if we need a sustained solution to this problem of air pollution. Okay. So moving on, what we identified as the kind of limits of the current regulatory framework. Just taking examples of the 2 action plans which are in place in the National Capital Region, which is the Comprehensive Action Plan and the Graded Response Action Plan. 2 of these measures that the government have taken in the last few years, and they're quite proud of these measures. But if you look at these action plans, they're really just laundry lists of actions that they propose. So for instance, the CAP is 93 actions under 12 heads without any prioritization. They have identified agencies responsible, but what it doesn't say is that if this agency doesn't meet the timeline or does not achieve what it's required to be, what is the accountability mechanism? It also doesn't say which of the 93 actions are going to take place first, second, third, and why. So, I mean, this kind of an unprioritized laundry list approach hasn't really taken us far, and we would suggest that that's not the way we should go. Secondly, there seems to be an assumption in place that the problem is only with regard to enforcement. We often hear that India has many laws and regulations which are all very perfect, and all that we need is our institutions and our administration to work properly and ensure that it's an enforcement problem. We don't think that's correct. Actually, the problem is also in the designing of those laws and regulations, along with an enforcement issue, but to say that this is solely an enforcement problem would certainly be a misplaced characterization of the whole issue. The third is that there's really a lack of strategic thinking while we are proposing and implementing solutions. Clearly, one size does not fit all. So if crop burning is going to be solved by giving 1,200 crores in the budget, it's not going to solve the problem because we haven't heard the farmers' concerns out as to whether they're in a position to use the happy seeders in the first place or not. If we are going to suggest that we should stop using private cars, do we have public transport in place? No. Do we have an incentive for people to change their behavior? No. So there are a lot of issues involved. It's very difficult to just say there's one quick fix to this. Yes, something like Badarpur power plant, there was an administrative fix that you could just shut it down, but it's not something that's likely to happen with regard to many other sources of pollution. And finally, there seems to be no effort to communicate to the public what's the rationality behind a particular solution. So for instance, if we are going to introduce the odd-even rule, we have to explain to the public why this rule is going to have any impact, if at all. Or if we are going to ensure that there is public transport, why should the public move to public transport? Why should industries be shut down? So this rationality behind administrative measures needs to be communicated to the public so that in their minds they are able to kind of gauge their expectations of where these solutions are going to take us, how far these solutions are going to take us. So some of the ways in which we think we should move forward towards enhanced air quality. First of all, we really think the political class needs to internalize air quality as a vote bank issue. Right now, the political class really thinks that this is something, it's a cost, an inevitable cost that has to be borne for progress, which is not true. Secondly, we need to ensure that it's on election manifestos, and not just on the manifestos, but going forward, governments should be able to, show that they are doing what they promised in their manifestos, and that their subsequent actions actually reflect the nature of the crisis at hand. So it's important to ensure that the political class has actually been involved. Secondly, there is obviously growing public awareness, but there's also confusion in terms of what are the sources, how can we combat them, what are the effects, how do we go forward, and there's a need to kind of come up with concrete, measurable, achievable targets in the short term so that the public also feels that they have some traction, that there is something that can be gained, but also something which shows that someone has put some thought to it and there's some rationale behind these things. Thirdly, we think there is a need to strategically rethink the regulatory and policy framework. So for instance, recently there has been this move that in industry there should be a fuel switch. We've heard of policy changes, pet coke should be banned, Bharat Stage 6 has to be brought in terms of transport. But this fuel switch, what cost does it come at? Should we be looking at fuel switches in industries, or should we be looking at better enforcement of pollution control mechanisms? So we have several choices to be made, but those choices have to be made through a properly thought through process because they come at huge cost, not just to the economy, but also to, for instance, the labor, the employees who are working in these industries. So these kind of choices cannot be made without a proper kind of stakeholder consultation and a policy making process which is thought through. Also, of course, I mean, this is something many people in the civil society have been demanding, is improved transparency and quality of information with regard to industries, sources of pollution across the board, and strengthening institutional capacity. I'll just conclude with, what we think are the top 5 points, and as I said, we'd like these points to be part of public messaging going forward, and we really welcome feedback from all of you, is that first of all, of course, air pollution in India is multiple times above nationally and internationally safe levels. And there should be no confusion about it. There should be no opportunity to challenge the fact that, or be complacent about that. Secondly, that health effects are severe, multiple and long-term, and they affect all demographic and economic groups. Thirdly, that it's caused by multiple sources, and each of them are extremely important. So whatever solution we take has to be a kind of sector-by-sector approach, and just concentrating on one sector or one subsector or one type of a solution, whether it's a regulatory solution or an institutional solution or a financial solution, is really not going to take us far. And so also finally, that public and the political class, they both have to have a buy-in. They both have to see that there's something for them in it for this to, for air pollution to be solved in a more sustainable and long-term fashion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Shivani. I think you very clearly laid out the issues for us. Let me turn now to Professor Somnathan, to take us through some more detailed research, understanding this problem a little bit more deeply. Please. Welcome. Ritesh Kumar Singh has just joined us.
So, thank you. I'm very glad to collaborate with Center for Policy Research on this issue of air pollution, which is very important. So at the Indian Statistical Institute, we have the Center for Research on the Economics of Climate, Food, Energy and Environment, CECFEE, and we've been doing a number of studies. We've been doing a number of studies on the economics of doing something about air pollution. And I'll talk a little bit about that work in just a moment, but I just want to mention that I'm going to go into, very briefly, I'm going to talk to you about each of those sectors that Shibani just talked about, and that some research that we're doing in each of those sectors to try to understand how one can mitigate, improve air pollution in each of these sectors. But before I go there, I just want to mention that, yes, it's kind of what Shibani said is that we really need to think of this as a very widespread and broad problem, and that we have to improve our institutional capacity in order to be able to deal with this problem. And in that context, I just want to mention that just a couple of days ago, a group of economists led by Raghuram Rajan released a report called the Economic Strategy, an Economic Strategy for India. I was one of those economists, and there is a part on environment and institution building to deal with environmental problems in that. And so if you're interested in those issues, I encourage you to go to our website, the CECFEE webpage, or to go to the University of Chicago Center in Delhi webpage, where you can find the report and you can find my note on environment as well. That's to deal with the institutional issues. But now I want to dive into each of these issues and talk about some studies that we're doing. So the first study is in the household sector, and it is looking at electric induction stoves usage in central Uttar Pradesh, in Sultanpur district actually. So the question that we're asking is, how much do electric induction stoves actually substitute for traditional chulhas? Are they simply add-ons to traditional chulhas and LPG? Or does their presence substantially reduce solid fuel use and the resulting air pollution? So what the study tries to do is to measure electricity availability, induction stove use, and air pollution on a minute-to-minute basis over a one-year period to try and answer these questions. And the data collection began, we started collecting a little bit of data in August, but comprehensive data collection began on the 1st of September. And there are many co-authors on this rather large and complicated project, some of whom are here in the room. So there are basically three kinds of equipment we're using. We're using these air quality sensors. So there's a picture of that over there, above a chula in one of these kitchens. Then there is an ammeter which measures whether this induction stove is being used at any given minute. And then we're collaborating with Prayas in Pune that has this electricity supply monitoring initiative, and that tells us whether there is actually power in the line coming to the house at any given time. Okay, so let me just show you here an indicator of the relationship between electricity quality and induction stove use. So on the vertical axis, we have percentage of induction stove use. I think, which one? This one is in the morning, and this one is in the evening. So during morning cooking times and evening cooking times. And you can see that as the voltage goes up, notice these are very low voltages, and voltage is supposed to be 230. But the quality of power supply in this part of UP, in rural UP, is very poor. So you get a lot of low voltage. The interesting thing is that even when there's low voltage, look at this. This is just 150, right? It's very low voltage. And yet there's a significant fraction of the time during the morning cooking time and during the evening cooking time, there is induction stove use, right? So this equipment is apparently robust enough to be used even in these poor conditions. So that's the first point I want to make. Of course, it does matter. Once you get below some level, then basically it drops off to zero. Okay, next. So here, let me just show you very briefly this rather complicated graph. But I think what I want you to focus on, these are basically, so if you look here, this is PM 2.5 being measured on this axis. These are very high levels, right? So you're starting at 100 here and going up to 250. So these are basically predicted levels of PM 2.5, or you can think of them as average levels of PM 2.5 from our data. And what you see is that this is the level in non-cooking times, that is neither morning nor evening, okay, and that's about 100, right? Then if it's a morning cooking time, then the level of air pollution goes up dramatically within the household. Okay, it goes up to more than 200, so more than doubles. Similarly, if it's an evening cooking time, again, it about something like doubles, right? What we're interested in, however, is if the induction stove is used during a cooking time, what happens? And the answer is, during the morning cooking time, if the induction stove is not in use, this is the average PM 2.5 level, which is something like 220. If the induction stove is in use during that cooking time, the average PM 2.5 level falls to something like 160, right? So this is really a substantial effect of the usage of the induction stove. So what this is telling us is that, and similarly, this is evening cooking time that is without induction stove use, this is with induction stove use. Here the effect is smaller, but it is still quite substantial.
Is this inside the house? Or?
Inside the house. We also have monitors outside the house controlling for the outside air quality. So what we see here is that this basically answers that question that I was telling you. This is 2 months of data, right? We're going to collect many more months of data until monsoon next year. What this tells us is that induction stoves do have a substantial effect. They really do substitute to some degree for the use of traditional solid fuels, and they do have an impact, right? And this is in the case of most of these households also have LPG, mind you, right? So this is, even though there's another clean fuel in the mix here, this one adds on to that mix. So I think that this is one of those things that tells us that, you know, there isn't just one solution to this problem, that is LPG, that you need multiple solutions because people use different technologies for different needs at different times. We all do, actually. If you think about your own kitchen, you'll find there are many different appliances and you're doing different things. You have a microwave for one thing, you have an electric kettle for one thing, you have a gas stove for something else. Okay, all right. Let me move to the second study. This is still in the household sector. This is a study that is just about soon to begin in rural Indore district of Madhya Pradesh. And here the question is, how much does information about health effects of air pollution increase LPG use and reduce firewood use? And so we're looking at, this is with two collaborators, Farzana Afridi, who's my colleague at ISI, and Shishit Devnath, who's at Indian School of Business. We look at 150 villages, 20 households per village. Half of the randomly chosen villages will be given information during the year about dangers of cooking with solid fuels. They'll be shown videos and given other material by health workers. And we will be monitoring the LPG use to see how much this information increases usage. So basically, this is trying to get the Ujjwala program, which has been an enormous success, to work even better. Okay, so we will get results from the study over the course of the next year. Here's the third study. So this is about the power sector now, so I'm moving on to the power sector. And this study is with a colleague, Shoibal Chakravarti at ATRI, and it's looking at measuring the social costs of coal and renewable power. And the question is, how expensive is coal compared to renewables when we include the external costs? That is, the costs that are not being paid by the generators, but which are being imposed on the rest of society, right? In the case of coal-fired power, the bulk of those costs is coming from pollution, and in fact, it's coming from deaths due to air pollution, okay? In the case of renewables, the cost is coming from the fact that when you put in variable renewables like solar PV and wind power, then you have to integrate them into the power system, all right? And that has some costs. Okay, so here's a picture which summarizes basically our paper. So what we have is that we have coal capacity in gigawatts on this axis, going from 0 to 150, which is about the amount of capacity that's online and available at any given time. And on the vertical axis, we have costs in rupees per unit, rupees per kilowatt hour, sorry. Okay. And this red line here tells you what is the operating cost, which is only the fuel cost of running coal plants, right? And this vertical line tells you those lines there are the average costs of solar PV and wind power, and those shaded areas are the range of costs of solar PV and wind power in the year 2018-19, right? These are for plants that start up, get commissioned in 2018-19. And this is various costs of different coal plants arranged from cheapest to more expensive along this axis. And what you can see is that even when you look at fuel costs, more than half of Indian coal capacity just to operate the plants that are already there is more expensive in social terms than building new renewables and running them. Okay? If you look at the total cost, which will include capital costs for building new coal plants, you can see basically that almost all new coal plants that you would build would be more expensive than building new renewables. I want to emphasize that the external costs that we're measuring here are coming for coal are coming mainly from pollution, but they do not include climate costs. And there are various factors that we have not been able to quantify, and therefore they are not included, right? So the bulk of this is basically coming from mortality due to air pollution, and then there's a significant component coming from mining externalities in the region of the mines. So what this is basically telling you is that the implication is very, very clear. India needs to start moving away from coal and towards renewables at quite a fast pace, and therefore we are going to need policies in order to better integrate the renewables into the system. Right now, the renewable integration costs are not very large because renewables are still a fairly small percentage of the power supply, but they will increase as we go forward. And so we need policies to promote renewables with storage, dispatchable renewables, and so on. We've had extremely successful policies in the last few years that have promoted renewables, and we need to move on to the next stage. Okay, so let me go on to the next sector, which is transport. And here, this is a study with a master's student of mine at the ISI, Ritvik Pandey. And we're basically interested in the question here of how much will an increase in the diesel price relative to the petrol price reduce pollution? So we've just started up, and Ritvik will be working on this for his master's thesis in the next semester. So let me just show you a couple of tables. Diesel versus petrol. So these are PM 2.5 emissions in grams per kilogram of fuel used. If you look at petrol, it's about 0.2. If you look at diesel, it's 5.4, right? So diesel is producing much more PM than petrol. If you look at NOx, nitrogen oxides in grams per kilogram of fuel, that should be kilogram, I think. Or maybe it's, anyway. The point is here, in the case of petrol, it's 0.03. In the case of diesel, it's 1.1. So you're talking about something which is more than 30 times as polluting in terms of NOx. Okay? So we really need to worry about the fact that we have had a significant dieselization of the passenger vehicle fleet in the last many years, right? Now, this is what we're going to study the effects of this. So this is starting in 1992 up to 2016, right? These are years passing on the x-axis, and up here we have the relative difference of the diesel price. So it's basically the petrol price minus the diesel price divided by the diesel price, right? So when it goes to zero, that would mean that the prices are the same. Over here, it's telling you that the diesel price is twice as high as the petrol price. So you started off with a very high ratio of diesel to petrol prices, then it fell dramatically in the early 2000s, more or less flattened out where diesel prices are roughly 40% higher in the early 2000s, and then went down again after the policy of removing the subsidy to diesel that began in 2013 and was more or less complete by 2015 with an increase in diesel fuel taxation. So what we see here is that the wedge between diesel and petrol has been closing over these years, and what this study is going to do is going to look at the impacts of that on the relative consumption of diesel and petrol, and therefore in the amount of pollution that is being produced. And of course, the implication for policy is that we really ought to actually close this price wedge completely. It should go below the axis because diesel is the more polluting fuel. Okay, let me move to the last sector. This is a study on a potential solution to crop residue burning, and it is being done by Dr. P.P. Krishnapriya with other authors from various collaborating institutions, the Nature Conservancy, CMIT, and others. So what they have done is they have surveyed about 1,000 farming households in 52 villages in 4 districts in Punjab, where the crop burning is most intense, which is these districts in southeast Punjab. Here are some of the results from that. So if you look at how many happy seeder users there are as a percentage of farmers, you see that if you look at that all villages, it's about slightly more than 10%. These KVK villages are villages that have a Krishi Vigyan Kendra, so those are only a few of them. They're not very representative. Other villages are probably representative of the typical Punjab village, and there you see the percentage of happy seeder users is only about 4%. Happy seeder, I hope that you are all aware, is a machine that allows you to basically plant wheat crop after the rice crop without having to burn the residue. Right? That's the main feature. Okay, so how many farmers, and there is a big government program, of course, to promote the happy seeder, as you may have read about, which Shibani mentioned, that government has allocated something like 1,200 crores to this last year. So what about awareness? How much do farmers actually know? What we see is that, well, awareness of the happy seeder is actually quite high. It's more than 80%, right? And more than, again, more than 80% of farmers have seen a happy seeder, they know how it works, okay? But only a few are using it in their own farms, right? Okay, what about perception about happy seeders among these farmers? Well, the perceptions are generally favorable, but they're not great. So if you look at the first two, these are perceptions about whether they increase yield in the long run and in the short run. Blue means that the farmers agree. Red is neutral and green is disagree. Okay, so you can see that about half of the farmers think that it increases yield. Many more are neutral and only a few disagree, right? Now, when you turn to sort of negative effects of the happy seeder, severe problems with rodents, with weeds, reduction of yields in the long run and the short run, here you find that, again, about half of the farmers disagree that there are these problems, and most of them are neutral, and only a few are perceiving and facing these problems, right? So all of this is quite promising, actually, for the adoption of this technology. And finally, if you look at other good features, it saves fuel, it saves labor, it saves water, and nearly all of them agree, right? So the happy seeder has these very good features, and therefore I think that so far it appears that the prospects for promotion on the basis of the survey are quite good, but we have a long way to go in terms of penetration. Okay, so what about farmer perceptions about constraints to use of a zero-till drill or happy seeders? So constraints are that these are percentage of farmers who answered yes to these questions. Basically, the first thing I want you to look at is the bottom one, which is farmers who don't perceive any constraints at all, and that's about 38% of farmers. Okay, so that's a significant fraction. But there are also some farmers who had problems. So, for example, about 20-25% of farmers say it doesn't work well with deep track marks of a harvester, right? So a harvester makes furrows in the field, and then a happy seeder doesn't work well in that case. There are also service problems where they say that service is not available on time. That seems to be the perception for about 20% of them. And then there are others, various other issues that farmers have had in smaller numbers. Okay, so those are just some of an indication to give you an idea of the kind of research that we are doing on various aspects of the air pollution problem. And I think I'd like to emphasize is that in order to solve these problems, these are very complex technical problems. They span different parts of the economy and of industry and agriculture and so on. So we need a lot of research to understand these problems, and we need a great deal of institutional capacity to tackle these problems. So this is not something that's going to happen in 1 day or 2 days, but we do need to solve these problems. We need to put in the investments in terms of building institutions and building research and building knowledge, and in taking that to action with well-defined programs, well-designed programs and policies to make an impact and reduce this pollution, get it down to safe levels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Somanathan. This is fascinating research, and hopefully we can find a way of getting the results as they emerge out to this audience, and maybe we can talk about doing that because some of these some of this work is, I think, just on in its early days, and the results are already really fascinating. So with these two inputs, I'd like to now turn to our panelists and get some reaction from them. To try and structure the conversation a little bit, maybe I can just pose a couple of questions broadly focused on each of these presentations and invite each of you to react. I want to start really with a little bit of emphasis on the kinds of questions Shibani raised. And in particular, the proposition she put out that while we have an emergent policy framework in place around air pollution in India, is the challenge now simply to put our heads down and implement that framework? Is the framework adequate to the complexity of the situation? Do we need to keep refining that framework? What are the challenges of implementation? Can we redefine the framework to address those challenges more completely? Maybe that some reflection on the policy framework and the implementation question is something we could spend a little bit of time inviting comments from the panelists on, as well as anything else that struck you, in particular from the first presentation. And then we'll do something similar with the second one. Can I invite you, Mr. Singh, to actually... Well, we have a microphone right in front. It'll be more informal if we just go back and forth, perhaps.
Thank you, Dr. Subhash. Thanks for inviting me for this very interesting discussion. As far as the question whether we are lacking only in implementation and the broad framework is in place, I think I would broadly agree with what Shibani has said in her presentation, that there's a huge challenge of implementation. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But we also need to be continuously looking at how we refine the broad framework that is in place. If I can just give you a couple of examples. In Delhi, for example, people who follow this sector would probably be aware that there is an approved fuel notification which bans the use of pet coke, furnace oil, and all the polluting fuels for use in Delhi. Interestingly, this notification is not there in the NCR region. So while for example, I think in Rajasthan, the draft has been put out in the public domain, but the final notification is still not there. In UP and in Haryana, we are not even at the draft stage. So clearly, there is also the issue of the broad regulatory framework being in place also needs to be constantly addressed. And as far as implementation is concerned, I think there is a huge, huge challenge of implementation, even in Delhi. In fact, the Ministry of Environment and the Delhi government work very closely, and we had recently launched a 2-week Clean Air for Delhi campaign, in which I also went out along with the team just to get a sense of what is actually happening. So if you go to the industrial areas in Delhi, the implementation of all the rules that we have is really, really something that is food for thought for all of us. So the implementation in the hotspots in Delhi is certainly something that none of us is very happy about. And we are always trying to impress upon the Delhi government that implementation is something that needs to be very, very seriously focused on. So I think it's both implementation as well as looking at the regulatory challenges as they emerge. So we need to basically look at both the issues.
Vinuta, could I ask you to comment on this? You've been working a lot with a group of civil society activists trying to figure out ways of engaging productively, trying to sort of, both support the government as well as put a little pressure on the government to move faster. What is your experience in doing all this?
I would actually agree that it has to be a mix of engaging both with policy as well as implementation. And the reason for that is also because it is a complex problem. It is going to require solutions both at point sources as well as behavioral changes. And the complexity is even more enhanced by the courts jumping in and various courts jumping in with orders. So the challenge for civil society to engage with this issue is really what is priority? What does the solution roadmap really look like? Where, if civil society engaged and put in their efforts, Is it about merely creating greater awareness and political salience for the issue, or is it about jumping in and trying to get a solution implemented, and if so, which one? So I think one grapples with possibly similar problems of looking at both engaging at the policy end as well as engaging at implementation. But I think there is the necessity certainly for looking at prioritizing where we will get the maximum impact in terms of investing both the energies of the policy makers as well as on implementation. And there I would say that point sources, possibly with regulatory frameworks that actually work, should have a better chance of working than, say, trying to stop Diwali crackers from being burst or stubble burning. While I'm not in any way saying those are any less important to work on, but they're certainly not going to work overnight when you're going to have to change behaviors. Whereas on thermal power plant emission standards, for example, we haven't really made much progress, and one should be making progress there.
Right, and that's certainly sort of a point that comes back to Som's study there on coal versus renewables. Nitin, can I invite you in on this, but maybe also ask you to, in reflecting on this issue, maybe talk about the fact that many of these sources and trying to control them also have sort of a political charge, right? So if you're talking about Delhi industries, many of these industries might have to be owned by politically connected people. You have issues with very legitimate issues with labor and jobs if you shut down those industries. How does air pollution manage these complex politics? How does air pollution regulation manage these complex politics?
Sure. Let me maybe try and address this with three ideas, and I'll propose these to the audience, and we can comment on these and perhaps think about. This is what I've thought of several years, because one, that I think the environmental laws and the governance system we have is a byproduct of a certain era that came pre-90s, came as a reaction to the Bhopal tragedy, and it tends to address only a certain kind of situation. It does not, even at that stage was meant to address point pollution, not look at large processes. Post-90s and liberalization, it became a process of rent seeking. There is clear evidence available now for decades, almost 2 decades of work, showing that the system of governance itself of environmental regulations is corrupt to its bone. And let's not make any, it's not useful to be calm and quiet about it, I think. We've seen that it's not about the nature of what party is in power, etc., but it is implicitly meant for rent seeking. And therefore, we reach the point we do. It's structurally not in a position to look at large processes over times and address it. To give you a simple example, how can you have a long-term solution being sought out of very short-term discretionary notifications? The nature of governance requires that you have large planning done, you have targets which are not done by the idea of an executive order, but you have large governance spaces for participation, and they are structurally there long-term. They cannot be tested by simple discretion of 5 officers working in opacity. We've not been able to address it, and I think we've escaped. There is clearly a reason why we do not address these questions. There is a political economy that is driven by the kind of rent seeking that happens through these laws. Two, and this is a larger question, I don't have the answer, but I've always had the question, is I don't think in our society we are at a position, and maybe we are unique, perhaps if you look at even Brazil and other emerging economies, we do not consider public health as a right. I don't think in our sociology, in our social systems, an average citizen believes it's the government's job to provide us health services. The larger challenge of air pollution and why we don't get more angry about it perhaps comes from the fact, to my mind, that we don't think that the government is supposed to even provide primary health services to us. We do have a long history of having depended on the private sector, whether it's the quackery end, low-cost quackery end, or the high-end quackery end of this business. but we have depended on that to the point that we might have adopted a system from, say, perhaps Europe of rights-based mechanism of delivery. So we have the right to clean air, which goes back, I think, if Shivani would remember which year it came to the Supreme Court. But the fact is these rights are not embodied in us as a society. They're embodied perhaps somewhere in law, in a Supreme Court order, etc. And that's a larger challenge, I think, that we need to wonder about and fix. So I don't think these hue and cry about air pollution causes public health, everyone's suffering because of it, therefore we should address it further. I think there's a larger problem there. Third, and this goes back, I think, to the question you're asking, our political economy, and this is again, I'm sorry if I sound a hopeful skeptic on this point. Our political economy of our elections is driven in such a nature that a set of our laws are going to be constantly used for rent seeking. They are meant for, say, monthly collections. Let's use the phrase because it's helpful to not use euphemisms. There is an annual investment that needs to be made in the electoral politics. There is a return to be sought thereafter once we are invested in that electoral politics. And what we see perhaps on the end of environmental regulations is just a byproduct of it. There is a larger challenge. And I think to that point, I'm actually very optimistic, and I find it amazing the amount of work that civil society and courts and others have got done despite this political economy is fascinating. I don't think too many other societies would have reached this sense of, even in certain classes, this heightened level of anger, frustration, action on air pollution is quite substantial, because to my mind, the political economy would not allow this at all. So I think we've reached far ahead. I would also be, and I'll end with this, I don't think political action requires more than a little science. Science is good. You cannot wait for science to come, and science involves. I don't think political decision making hinges itself on saying we need this basic quantum of science before we can act. Politics uses science not to do things. I don't think it uses science to do things. It's a very smart tool to say we do not have adequate science. Therefore, I think we should re-question whether positing science as a priority to get work done may actually threaten and slow down the pace at which work gets done on this. We will always evolve, and I think it's essential that work like this gets done. But at the same time, I don't think we should hinge and link action too much and say, once we have these 5 studies together, then we can go and move these next 2 steps. I've never seen politics and decision-making work in that system. I hope it does, but I don't think it does at the moment.
Thank you. Very, very thought-provoking comments. Just on the last point, there is often this conversation where we don't have enough sensors in India to really understand the air pollution problem, and that's true in the sense that there's a lot more investment in sensors in Delhi and the NCR than there is in the rest of the country. At the same time, what we do know suggests that we are some multiple times safe levels. So, whether we want to invest a great deal more effort in understanding whether we're 10 times, 12 times, or 15 times WHO safe levels is somewhat all of them reach to the same point, which is we need to act. And we know enough to know we need to act. So I think it's a point well taken. Maybe just a quick second round. This thing to come back to you. 2 loosely linked questions. First is, given what Nitin has just said, in a sense you're in a we appreciate, I think you're in quite a difficult position, right? As the person, the Joint Secretary at the Ministry, on the spot with a lot of these issues, and the legacy of how the administration works, the kind of short-termism that I think Nitin accurately painted for us, the fact that the implementation machinery, shall we say, you don't always have full control over exactly how it functions. These are all challenges in the implementation of air pollution regulation. In that context, are we sort of left with a situation that says, we're not going to solve air pollution until we solve these broader problems? Do we have to wait to solve air pollution until we solve election financing, for example? That's a very depressing message. What are the sort of shorter-term wins that you can see? And then related to that, now bridging perhaps to Professor Somnath's presentation, what are the concrete bits of information? What is the concrete research? What are the sort of pointed observations, for example, the study that was done on coal versus renewable energy? What are the kinds of things that will be useful from a policymaker point of view? And then when we move to Vinuta, a similar question for civil society. What do we need to understand? What do we need to know better? How can knowledge actually help take us forward?
Thank you, Dr. Dubash. While I do agree to the broad thrust that there is a huge problem in our country as far as vested interests are concerned, I'm inside the government, but I say this openly that one can't really deny this whole huge issue that exists in our country. But in spite of that, I can say with a fair degree of confidence that there have been possibly incremental steps. These may not be something that has produced changes dramatically and overnight, but there have certainly been incremental steps over the last couple of years which have resulted in a demonstrable effect. So I would not really be so pessimistic or skeptic. I think I would be guardedly optimistic in the sense that I always tell the civil society plays a very, very important role in this. And I tell all my people in the civil society that please keep the pressure on the government. Because as you say, there are a large number of vested interests and it is always easier. In fact, a very interesting from the University of Chicago, the researchers who do a lot of very interesting stuff there, they showed us some data on the stack measurements in the industries. So the day when the team from the State Pollution Control Board is visiting them, the pollution levels are close to zero, and on the other days it's all in the red zone. So I asked, what's going on? So they said that they actually start pumping in about 200% extra air in those stacks to make sure that the pollution levels are within the limits that are prescribed. So the point is that all these issues are indeed there. So what do we do? And we are working very, very closely with all the leading scientific institutions in our country to find solutions. So again, on a slightly more optimistic note, we basically work very closely with IIT Delhi, IIT Kanpur, and we would love to work with more institutions. I know there are many institutions that are present here to find out solutions that work. So, and even for formulating policy, for example, the recent order to ban the use of pet coke, the import of pet coke all over the country, that was based on a study that was led by professors from IIT Kanpur and IIT Delhi. So I don't think we need to wait to fix the larger problems that plague the country. I think there is sufficient demand from the people. There is a sufficient acknowledgement from the political classes that this is something that needs to be done. And I'm sure a lot of you are aware that this issue is monitored by the Prime Minister's Principal Secretary on a bi-monthly basis. He heads the Principal Secretary to the Prime Minister heads the high-level task force that has been set up, and he reviews this on a bi-monthly basis. So even when there is no emergency, it's not that we meet only during the winter months. We meet all across the year. I think we have had about 7-8 meetings in 2018, and every bit of the information is very, very closely. So I think that the positive message is that there is a very large amount of attention and there's a very large degree of focus on this issue. And the role of the civil society, the role of the judiciary is to keep that pressure on. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add some data points to the discussion in terms of public awareness of the issue. So we just did an analysis of 5,000 people across mostly the Indo-Gangetic belt, from of course Delhi NCR to even other places like Korba, Singrauli, Chandrapur, Kolkata, so across the board, Agra, Kanpur, Lucknow, and we found that awareness levels on air quality and concern were both extremely high, 98% in a number of the metros in the belt. Everywhere it was above 80%. So In terms of it having public salience, it certainly exists. I think the challenge is really to translate that into getting concerned at a level that demands action. And there I would say I'm extremely optimistic because from the time possibly this debate hit the headlines, possibly at least, in terms of this scale and this round of concern on air quality, we've really moved. So we also track media, and we found that it's no longer just a winter issue. It does get reported in at significant levels throughout the year. So I feel very optimistic that progress is being made. I think the challenge for civil society really is, and of course the health communications really changed that. The not so much the morbidity, mortality issue, but the morbidity issue. The fact that I'm going to live with illness, or I'm seeing my child on having to use an inhaler constantly. Those things are beginning to emotionally affect people, and therefore people are wanting to demand action. And it is important that middle class India is finally being affected by this in a way that a lot of polluted parts of the country have often been affected, or we saw the 2.5 indoor pollution, which we've not been able to do very much about for a long time. So I think there are a number of things that from the perspective of civil society is very positive, and we are going to see change. I think what's missing is a sense of what can we do, what are the solutions, what should we prioritize on, and that will give us a sense of how to put greater pressure.
Okay. Nitin, can I turn to you and also ask you to maybe reflect on some of the concrete results that Professor Somnathan showed. I mean, I think it's quite startling, right? We always assume that the use of induction stoves will have a big effect, but this is sort of a carefully done measurement of that, as well as the quite gripping two curves that Som showed us, both the sort of coal costs and then coal with internalization of social costs. How does one make use of this kind of research? Does something as pointed as this actually help change things? In your earlier round of remarks, you were, expressed some skepticism about whether this sort of rational information basis can push policy. Do you think that this kind of pointed research can help do that?
No, sorry if I sounded like that. I think science is essential for public pressure. It's essential for conversation which drives policy despite the existing political framework. Even at a time when we're living in an era where numbers are fudged so randomly that we don't even know what's happening to our economy, science does help a lot. It does push conversation in a certain direction. It can, at times, push it in right direction. We can recalibrate ourselves and go in the right direction. But I think what I was trying to say was that the way politics uses science is perhaps different than how we as people use science. Anyone who's in a position of governance will use science selectively, carefully. I mean, we all know the politics of science as well. The kind of questions you ask drive out a certain set of answers, perhaps. So drives out information in a certain direction rather than the other. So as an example, when my colleagues were traveling out for election last month, I suggested to all of them just pose questions while you ask about what are the key issues. Keep your antennas up, saying, at least in, say, Chhattisgarh, particular areas where you go, where we know pollution is high, check what do they say. And some of them were diligent enough to keep notes, etc. Clearly for them, pollution was not referred to as pollution. Pollution was at times referred to as unlivability, migration, linked with jobs, etc., etc. I think science is essential, but we should also politically start thinking what are the kinds of questions we need to ask. His work on, say, I've been fascinated by the volume of science he's been able to produce, his center's been able to produce. At the same time, I keep thinking, we are in a position where I don't think we are internalizing the environmental costs in our policy making. There is no framework right now that exists that allows that to come in. So will we shift from solar to from away from coal towards solar or other forms? It's not dependent on internalizing the social cost. If it was a factor, then I would have imagined that when we created GST, we would not have absorbed the entire cess that we had put on clean air into compensating states for GST, right? We would have gone that far of have absorbed 45,000 crores from the system and then thrown it back into the system. Clearly, our political economies do not think like this. Clearly, our accounting systems don't think like this. But will they? Perhaps in 5 years' time, if this kind of science comes out in larger volumes, even if it's directed all over in all directions, I think it will force a certain kind of conversation at the policy making level. Will it change the nature of our governance? Perhaps not. I think there we do need a complete rethinking of how our laws are placed for environmental governance. We cannot have bureaucratic discretion available through a law which says, I mean, Shivani would be better placed to saying this, but we have a law which says under Section 3, the central government can do anything it wants to safeguard environment. Now, to me, that's a carte blanche to a set of bureaucracy and a politician to say, I will tell you when I send a notice and when I'll not. And complete lack of answerability on it, because it came from a certain era. That era has changed. We have disaggregated politics now. In the 80s, when we had this law, we had a very centralized sense of government. That's changed. I think if we are not revising that vision of environmental governance, we lend ourselves, regardless of the best of science that Dr. Somnathan might produce, we lend ourselves into a rent-seeking process yet again. And that, I think, is a bigger challenge.
It's a very, very fair observation. I mean, perhaps the role of science is that it's necessary to get these things on the agenda, to make the case, to build public support, but by no means is it sufficient to drive all the political processes. And thinking about the larger sort of edifice of environmental governance is really necessary. Before I turn to the audience, let me give both Som and Shibani a chance to make any sort of comments or reactions they have to these remarks for a couple of minutes each, and you can maybe in the meantime think about your questions. Som, would you like to go first?
Yes, I can just say that with regard, I think this mic is on, right?
Yes.
Can you hear me, right? Not loud enough. So, yes. So I think that I have a couple of remarks to make, just reacting to the issues about what is it that drives the politics to get action, sustained action, as opposed to, episodic action going. And I think that to think about this, we have to do a few basic comparisons, right? So for example, if we compare the regulatory staff in India for pollution regulation, take for example the CPCB, this is the central regulator. They have a few hundred employees. You want to compare that with the United States, the US Environmental Protection Agency has 14,000 employees, okay? So that's a difference. If you look at China, again, you see thousands of employees. But that's actually really understates the difference. And the reason it understates the difference is that many of the employees of the central and state pollution control boards in India are not scientific personnel. They're people whose job it is to go out and do inspections and then to report on them and keep the records, right? If you actually look at the scientific personnel, the numbers are just a few dozen. Right? Maybe even less, I don't know. If you look at the scientific personnel in the developed countries or in China in the regulatory process, you'll see that they number, in the hundreds and thousands. Right? So the reason for this, so what does this reflect? It reflects the fact that those countries, their political processes have created a demand for sustained regulation which has actual bite. Right? Because it's very hard to do sustained regulation with actual bite if you're working in a very resource-constrained environment, right? And here in India, the regulators, the CPCB and the state pollution control boards, are working in a very resource-constrained environment. They just don't have the staff, and they don't have the budgets to be able to deal with the scale of the problem that they're expected to deal with. So these people are really overstretched. So then we have to ask the question, well, why is that the case? Right? Well, clearly that's the case because we, the Indian public, just haven't made enough of a political demand to our elected governments to say that this is an issue that matters to us. You have to do something serious and sustained about it. So I think that that's really the bottom line. We have to have more public awareness, and that public awareness has to get to a level where it actually influences the political process, and then you will see actual results. I think in the meantime, there is a way forward, you know, to try to get things moving. And I think that very briefly, I'll just say that I think that we need to pay more attention to pollution fees. Right? Our legal structure is not aligned in those terms. It's aligned in terms of regulation. You're either allowed to do something or not allowed to do it. I think we need to move towards pollution fees in the sense that you have regulators. Their job is to measure how much pollution, and then given the amount of pollution you produce, you have to pay a fee. And that all of this should be done on the basis of, you know, studies which say, well, what is the damage from this pollutant? What's the estimated average damage? And we'll set the fee at that level. This will bring a lot of revenue in. If it's put into place, it'll bring a lot of revenue into the government, and the government can then use that revenue to basically make the investments necessary so that those industries, those interests which are hurt by this can sort of adjust to it, right, and can get out of it. So I think that that's the way the political process would work better. I don't see things going in that direction in our current environment, but we are a big country. We have many states, right? So maybe we can make a beginning somewhere once these ideas are out in the public domain, and then we can make progress along those lines.
Shivani, very quickly, you want to add something?
I
I want to make sure we have enough time for the audience.
Sure. So, I mean, just reflecting some of the things that Nitin and Vinuta also mentioned in terms of the regulatory framework and the need to change the laws. I mean, I do understand where Nitin is coming from, that the legal setup as it is right now is reflective of the times when it came in. But I mean, some of the research that some are doing is that actually we need not wait for those amendments. I mean, there is enough going for us right now in the laws as they were drafted in the 1980s, however inadequate they were, for the government to actually use those hooks, and Nitin himself mentioned about central government's powers, that there is enough for the government and the political class to actually go ahead with what the public is right now demanding. And it's almost the same argument as you made, Navroz, that, you know, we can always have more monitoring stations, but we have enough data right now to go forward. So I think even in terms of, though it will be great, there is a need to rethink our regulatory structure, but even with under-resourced pollution control boards, in fact, there's data that shows that pollution control boards are sending money back to the government because they're not able to spend money that was meant for pollution control. They're able to spend the money that's meant for salaries and administrative costs, but they're not able to spend the money that's meant for pollution control. So there's a problem there as well. So I think there's a lot that can be done where we are, though there is certainly scope to rethink the structure as it is.
Great, thank you. I just want to turn it now to the audience, but pick up a couple of things that are really important, I think, to take forward. We're talking about sustained, systematic change as opposed to episodic and ad hoc and reactive change. I think figuring out how to do that is the key. A couple of ground rules before I take on these hands. Because we have a lot of hands and we have about 20-25 minutes for discussion, I'm going to ask for 30 seconds or less, brief questions, preferably not very long comments, and we'll take 3 or 4 in a row and then turn to the panelists. So